In a small Kentucky town gymnasium, a 58-year-old single mother was about to face the most humiliating moment of her life. What started as her son's graduation ceremony took a shocking turn when she came face to face with a devastating request. Dolores May Hutchins wasn't your typical parent. For 18 years, she had worked 3 jobs to raise her valedictorian son, known for her unfiltered authenticity. When her son asked her not to attend graduation because he was embarrassed by her, she made a decision that would lead to confronting everything about class and love. The community would never be the same. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The phone rang just as Dolores May Hutchins was pulling the meatloaf from the oven, her worn oven mitts singed from 18 years of dinners. The call came on a Tuesday in late April, when the dogwood trees outside their rental house bloomed white against the Kentucky hills. "Tommy!" she hollered toward the back bedroom. "Phone's for you!" Tommy emerged from the hallway, his lanky frame filling the doorway as he reached for the cordless phone, with an expression that told Dolores this wasn't just any call. "Hello?" His voice carried that careful tone he'd developed, always prepared for disappointment, even when hoping for something more. Dolores watched her son's face transform. His dark eyes widened first, then his mouth opened slightly, and finally a smile spread across his features like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you. I'll be there Thursday for the meeting. Thank you so much." He hung up and stood there, staring at the phone as if it might ring again and take back whatever news it had delivered. "Well?" Dolores demanded. "What was that about?" Tommy turned to face her. "That was Principal Thornfield. Mom, I'm valedictorian." The words hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds before Dolores erupted. "Valedictorian!" she shrieked, throwing her oven mitts in the air and rushing toward Tommy. "My baby is valedictorian!" She wrapped him in a hug that lifted him slightly off his feet, despite the fact that he now stood 4 inches taller than her 5'3" frame. Her voice bounced off the kitchen walls, probably carrying to the neighbors' houses. "I knew it. I told everyone at the diner, my Tommy's gonna be valedictorian. And they thought I was just being a proud mama, but I knew it." Tommy returned, the hug, genuinely happy for a moment, feeling the pure joy radiating from his mother's fierce embrace. This was what he loved about her, the way she celebrated his victories as if they were her own. But as she pulled back and started talking about the ceremony, that familiar knot began forming in his stomach. "Oh, honey, we've got to plan. I need to take off work that day, and I'll need a new dress. Something nice for pictures. And we'll have your grandfather there, and I bet Missy's family will want to sit with us." As she talked, Tommy found himself imagining the graduation ceremony. Hundreds of families dressed in their Sunday best, sitting in neat rows. He could picture other valedictorians from years past, kids like Marcus Wellington, whose father owned half the town's commercial real estate. And then he imagined his mother, Dolores May Hutchins, who would arrive having rushed from her shift, at Murphy's Diner, probably still smelling faintly of coffee and bacon grease. Who would wave enthusiastically from the audience during his speech, maybe even call out encouragement. Who would want to take pictures with everyone afterward? Her voice carrying over the polite murmur of other families. The knot in his stomach tightened. "I should call Missy," he said, needing a moment away from his mother's overwhelming enthusiasm. Tommy retreated to his bedroom and dialed Missy's number. His room was small, but meticulously organized. Textbooks, stacked precisely, scholarship paperwork filed in a cardboard box. "I got it," he said when she answered. "Valedictorian?" Missy didn't sound surprised. "Oh my God, Tommy, that's amazing." "Yeah, I can't quite believe it." "I can. You've earned." Your mom must be losing her mind with excitement." Through his bedroom wall, Tommy could hear Dolores calling someone. sharing the news at a volume that suggested the entire county should know. Yeah, she's really excited. Missy caught the slight hesitation in his voice. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. This is good news. Tommy. He was quiet for a moment. It's just, you know how she gets. At school events and stuff. Missy did know. She'd seen Dolores at football games, cheering louder than anyone else. She'd witnessed her at parent-teacher conferences, asking questions with an intensity that made some teachers uncomfortable. She loves you, Missy said quietly. I know, it's just, sometimes I wish she could tone it down a little. Before Missy could respond, there was a knock at Tommy's door. Honey, your Pops is here. Tommy opened the door to find his grandfather, standing in the hallway, weathered hands gripping a wooden cane, his face creased into a smile that suggested he'd already heard the news. Earl Pops Hutchins moved slowly but with dignity, his 84 years showing in careful steps, but his eyes were clear and bright with pride. There he is, Pops said, his voice carrying the accent of Eastern Kentucky. My valedictorian grandson. Tommy felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was the man who had raised his mother after her own mother died young, who had worked 30 years in the coal mines, who had never missed one of Tommy's school events. The old man pulled Tommy into a hug that smelled of Old Spice and coffee. Your mama called me soon as she hung up, Pop said. Couldn't be prouder if you'd been elected president. Sit with me a minute, Pop said, lowering himself carefully onto Tommy's bed. Tommy sat, suddenly feeling 10 years old again. This is a big thing, being valedictorian, Pop said thoughtfully. Not many kids from families like ours get that honor. Families like ours? Pops gestured toward the kitchen, where Dolores could be heard making another call. Working folks. People who punch time clocks and count every dollar. Your mama worked 3 jobs to keep you in those college prep classes. Tommy nodded, remembering those mornings in Pops's ancient pickup truck when their car was broken. Point is, you earned this, not just with studying, but with character, with never forgetting where you come from. Through the wall, they could hear Dolores. Sally, it's Dolores. Honey, you will not believe what just happened. Pops caught Tommy's slight wince at his mother's volume. She's proud of you? I know. Sometimes when people haven't had much to celebrate, they celebrate a little louder when something good finally happens. From the kitchen came a crash, followed by Dolores's voice. I'm fine. Just dropped a pan. Pops chuckled. Might want to go help her before she destroys the kitchen. Tommy walked back toward the kitchen, where he found his mother attempting to cook a celebration dinner, while simultaneously talking on the phone. She had flour in her hair and a smile so wide it seemed to take up her entire face. This was his mother, chaotic, loud, unfiltered, and so full of love it sometimes felt like it might burst out of her small frame. She had raised him alone, working, jobs that left her exhausted but never too tired to help with homework. And he was absolutely terrified of what the other families would think of her at graduation. The realization hit him like a physical blow, the shame of it making his cheeks burn. Here was the woman who had given him everything, and he was worried about how she would look to people who didn't matter. But even knowing his feelings were wrong didn't make them go away. As Tommy watched his mother gesture wildly with a wooden spoon, talking about her baby the valedictorian, he found himself imagining graduation day again. This time, all he could think about was how Dolores would stand out among the other parents. And for the first time since receiving the call that should have been the best news of his life, Tommy wondered if there was a way to celebrate this achievement without the complication of his mother's overwhelming, authentic love. The thought made him feel sick, but he couldn't shake it. Dolores finally hung up and turned to beam at him, flour still dusting her graying hair. Come here, baby, she said, opening her arms wide. Let me hug my valedictorian one more time. Tommy went to her, letting himself be enveloped in her embrace, trying to memorize this moment of uncomplicated happiness. because deep down, he knew the conversation he was dreading was coming sooner than he wanted to face. 3 days later, Tommy stood in the mirror-lined hallway outside the school library, adjusting his tie for the third time. The pre-graduation reception for honor students and their families was about to begin, and his stomach churned with familiar anxiety. Through the glass doors, he could see tables draped in the school colors, blue and gold, with carefully arranged flowers and platters of reception food that looked far more elegant than anything he'd ever seen at home. "You look fine," Missy said, appearing beside him with her characteristic grace. She wore a simple black dress that somehow managed to look expensive, her dark hair pulled back in a way that emphasized her confident smile. "Stop fussing." "I'm not fussing," Tommy lied, smoothing his hair one more time. The suit was borrowed from Pops, altered by Dolores in the evenings after her diner shifts. It fit well enough, but Tommy was acutely aware that it wasn't new, wasn't tailored, wasn't the kind of thing the other honor students would be wearing. Through the doors, he could see his classmates arriving with their families. Marcus Wellington walked in wearing what was obviously an expensive suit, his father's hand on his shoulder as they surveyed the room with the confidence of people who belonged everywhere they went. Sarah Beth Morrison glided past in a dress that probably cost more than Dolores made in a week, her mother following behind with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to social events. "She'll be here," Missy said quietly, reading his thoughts. "I know. And she'll be proud of you." "I know that too." What Tommy couldn't say, what he couldn't even fully admit to himself, was that he was hoping his mother might somehow be different tonight. Maybe she'd worn something more subdued. Maybe she'd speak more quietly. Maybe, just this once, she wouldn't stand out quite so much. The wish made him feel like the worst son in the world. Principal Thornfield appeared in the doorway, her silver hair perfectly styled and her navy suit immaculate. She spotted Tommy immediately and made her way over with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested important conversations ahead. "Tommy, there you are," she said, her voice carrying the authority that came with 8 years of running the school. "I wanted to discuss your valedictorian speech. We should talk about length content expectations, and, of course, the themes we'd like you to emphasize." "Yes, ma'am." "Achievement through perseverance, the value of education, gratitude to teachers and family, the usual framework. Nothing too political or controversial, of course. We want this to be a celebration that unifies our community." Tommy nodded, but something in her tone struck him. The way she said, "unifies our community," suggested there were divisions that needed bridging, gaps that needed careful navigation. "And Tommy," Principal Thornfield continued, her voice dropping slightly, "this is a wonderful opportunity for you to represent not just yourself, but what's possible when students commit themselves to excellence. You're an inspiration to many families in our district." Again, that careful phrasing. Many families in our district. Tommy wondered if she meant families like his, families where parents worked multiple jobs, where college was a dream that required full scholarships, where graduation ceremonies were rare enough to be treasured. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the entrance. Tommy turned to see his mother hurrying through the doors, still wearing her Murphy's Diner uniform. A blue polo shirt with the restaurant's logo embroidered on the chest, and khaki pants that showed evidence of a busy lunch shift. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried the purse she'd owned for as long as Tommy could remember. "I'm so sorry I'm late," Dolores called out, her voice carrying across the reception area as she spotted Tommy. "The dinner rush went longer than expected, and then I couldn't find parking and—" She stopped mid-sentence as she realized the entire room had turned to look at her. The other families, dressed in their careful evening attire, regarded this interruption with varying degrees of curiosity and polite discomfort. Tommy felt his face burn with embarrassment, but Dolores recovered quickly, flashing the smile that had charmed diner customers for 18 years. "Well, don't I look like something the cat dragged in?" she said with a laugh that was meant to diffuse the tension but only seemed to amplify it. I told my manager I had to leave for my son's honor reception, and he said, "Which son is that?" And I said, "The one who's going to be valedictorian." Principal Thornfield stepped forward with professional grace. "Mrs. Hutchins, how wonderful that you could make it. Tommy was just telling me how excited you must be." "Excited doesn't even begin to cover it," Dolores said, beaming as she reached Tommy and pulled him into a hug that smelled of coffee and industrial cleaner. "I've been telling everyone at work, everyone at the grocery store, anyone who will listen. My baby's the valedictorian." Over his mother's shoulder, Tommy caught sight of Brenda Colton standing near the refreshment table. Mrs. Colton wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than his mother made in a month, her blonde hair styled in a way that suggested frequent salon visits. She was watching the scene with the kind of polite interest that didn't quite hide her judgment. "How lovely," Mrs. Colton said, her voice carrying just enough sweetness to make it unclear whether she was being genuine or condescending. "It must be so gratifying to see all your hard work pay off." Tommy wasn't sure if she was talking to him or his mother, but Dolores jumped into the conversation with typical enthusiasm. "Oh, it is. I always knew Tommy was special, even when he was little. He'd read everything he could get his hands on. Books from the library, newspapers, even the ingredients on cereal boxes. I used to joke that he was going to read himself right. Out of our little town, and look at him now." Mrs. Colton's smile grew tighter. "How authentic. It's so refreshing to meet families who really understand the value of education." The word authentic hung in the air like a subtle insult. Tommy caught the slight emphasis, the way it seemed to suggest that his family was somehow quaint or picturesque rather than simply real. "Education's everything," Dolores agreed, apparently missing the subtext entirely. "I told Tommy from the time he could walk that school was his way out, his chance to be something more than what I am." "Oh, I'm sure you've contributed more than you realize," Mrs. Colton said, and now the condescension was unmistakable. "Different types of families bring different perspectives to their children's education." Tommy felt Missy's hand slip into his, a silent show of support as the conversation continued to unfold like a slow-motion car accident. "That's right," Dolores said, still smiling, but something sharper creeping into her voice. "Perspective like working 3 jobs to pay for SAT prep courses. Perspective like driving a car with 200,000 miles to get to parent-teacher conferences. Perspective like knowing exactly what it costs to give your child a chance at something better." The room had grown quieter, other conversations pausing as people sensed the tension building between the two women. Mrs. Colton's composure slipped slightly. "I didn't mean to suggest—" "Oh, I'm sure you didn't mean anything at all," Dolores said, her smile now carrying an edge that Tommy recognized from the rare times his mother had been truly angry. "Sometimes people just say things." Principal Thornfield stepped in smoothly. "Well, I think we should all be celebrating our students' achievements tonight. Tommy, perhaps you'd like to get some refreshments." As the conversation dissolved into polite small talk, Tommy found himself studying the other families in the room. They moved with an ease he envied, speaking in modulated tones about summer plans and college preparations. They belonged here, in a way that his family never quite would, no matter how many honors he earned or how many scholarships he received. The realization settled in his stomach like a stone. This was what the next 4 years would look like, constantly navigating between two worlds, always conscious of the differences, always aware of how his mother's love and pride somehow translated differently in spaces like this. As the reception continued around him, Tommy made a decision that would haunt him for weeks to come. He began to imagine graduation day not as a celebration of his achievement, but as a test of whether he could find a way to honor his mother's sacrifices without subjecting either of them to the kind of judgment he'd witnessed tonight. The conversation he'd been dreading was no longer a possibility. It was becoming an inevitability. 2 weeks before graduation, Tommy sat at their kitchen table staring at his valedictorian speech draft while Dolores clattered around the kitchen, humming off-key as she prepared dinner after her double shift at the diner. The sound of her humming, something she did when she was particularly happy, made what he was about to do feel even worse. She'd been in an especially good mood all week, ever since she'd managed to get graduation day off from all 3 of her jobs. "First time in 18 years I've taken a whole day off for something fun," she'd announced proudly, as if this sacrifice was something to celebrate rather than evidence of how hard she'd always worked. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Tommy, honey, you want some coffee?" she called over her shoulder, already reaching for the pot. "I know you're working on that speech." "Sure, Mom." His voice came out smaller than intended. She brought him a mug, chipped, ceramic with a faded logo from some long-closed local business, and kissed the top of his head like she'd done since he was small. The gesture made his chest tight with guilt. "How's it coming?" she asked, peering over his shoulder at the laptop screen. "Good. Fine. It's about gratitude and perseverance." "That's perfect, baby. You've got plenty to say about both." She settled into the chair across from him, cradling her own coffee mug. "I've been thinking about what I'm gonna wear. I found this dress at the thrift store in Lexington. Navy blue, very classy. And I'm gonna get my hair done at that place on Main Street. Nothing fancy, just something nice." Tommy's stomach knotted tighter. She was trying so hard to fit in, to be the kind of mother who wouldn't embarrass him, and the fact that she felt she needed to change herself made what he was considering even more cruel. "Mom," he started, then stopped. "What is it, honey?" He stared at his laptop screen, the cursor blinking at the end of a sentence about family support. Nothing, just thinking. Dolores studied his face with the intuition of someone who'd been reading his moods for 18 years. "You nervous about the speech?" "A little. You shouldn't be. You're gonna be wonderful. I already told everyone at work they better watch it on the local news channel. Mary said she's gonna record it for me in case the quality's not good." The mention of his speech being broadcast locally made Tommy's anxiety spike. He'd forgotten about the news coverage. Forgotten that his graduation wouldn't just be witnessed by the families in attendance, but by anyone in town who happened to tune in. "Mom," he said again. And this time she heard something in his voice that made her set down her coffee mug. "What's wrong?" The words he'd been rehearsing for days stuck in his throat. He'd planned this conversation, had imagined different ways to approach it, but now that the moment was here, every possible version sounded heartless. "It's just, graduation is..." He tried again. "There are gonna be a lot of people there." "I know. I'm so proud that everyone's gonna see what an amazing young man I raised." Her pride was so pure, so uncomplicated, that Tommy felt physically sick. But the memory of the reception, of Mrs. Colton's barely concealed condescension, of the way other families had looked at his mother, drove him forward. What if... He forced himself to meet her eyes. "What if you didn't come?" The words hung between them like a physical barrier. Dolores blinked once, twice, as if she hadn't heard correctly. "What?" "To graduation. What if you didn't come to graduation?" Her face went through a series of expressions. Confusion, then hurt, then something that looked like she'd been slapped. "I don't understand." Tommy's rehearsed explanations crumbled. It's gonna be really formal, and there are gonna be lots of important people there, and I just thought maybe..." "Maybe what, Tommy?" The quiet way she said his name was worse than if she'd shouted. It was the voice she used when she was trying very hard not to show how much something had hurt her. "Maybe it would be better if I just focused on the speech and didn't have to worry about..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Worry about what? Her voice was barely above a whisper now. About you. The words hit the kitchen like a bomb. Dolores sat back in her chair as if the force of them had physically pushed her away from the table. About me, she repeated slowly. Mom, it's not about me embarrassing you. That's not what I said. It's what you meant. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the linoleum floor. All these years, all the work I've done, all the sacrifices I've made, and you're embarrassed by me. Mom, please. No. Her voice was stronger now, hurt transforming into anger. You don't get to Mom, please me right now. You just asked me not to come to your graduation. Your graduation, Tommy. The thing I've been working toward for 18 years. Tommy felt tears threatening and hated himself for it. It's not about you. It's about me. I just want everything to go perfectly. And I'm the thing that would make it imperfect. The accuracy of the statement, even though he'd never consciously thought it that way, made his silence damning. Dolores laughed, but it was a sound devoid of humor. You know what's funny? I've been so worried about what dress to wear, whether my hair looked right, whether I'd say the right things. I've been worried about embarrassing you, and apparently, I was right to worry. Mom, don't. She held up a hand to stop him. Just don't. I need to think about this. She walked to the kitchen window and stood there with her back to him, her shoulders rigid. In the reflection in the glass, Tommy could see her face, older than he'd ever noticed, tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. Do you know what I gave up for you? She asked quietly. Yes. No, you don't. You know about the jobs, about the money, about staying up late to help with homework, but you don't know about the rest of it. She turned to face him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I gave up dating because I didn't want to bring men around who might not understand how special you were. I gave up friends because I worked too much to maintain relationships. I gave up dreams because your dreams were more important. I gave up everything that might have made me the kind of mother you wouldn't be ashamed of. Each word hit Tommy like a physical blow. I'm not ashamed of you. Yes, you are. And you know what the worst part is? I understand why. The admission hung in the air between them, more painful than anger would have been. I see how those other families look at us, Tommy. I'm not stupid. I know what Mrs. Colton was really saying at that reception. I know I don't fit in with their country club manners and their designer clothes and their polite conversations about things that don't matter. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so familiar it made Tommy's chest ache. But I thought, God, I was stupid enough to think that none of that would matter to you. I thought you knew that everything I am, everything I've done, was for you. I thought you understood that my love was enough, even if my wardrobe wasn't. It is enough, Tommy said desperately. You are enough. More than enough. But not for graduation day. The simple statement carried the weight of 18 years of sacrifice and love and hope, all of it reduced to this moment of rejection. I just wanted one perfect day, Tommy whispered. One day where everything went exactly right. And I'm the thing standing in the way of that perfection. They stood in their small kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of their life together. The refrigerator covered with his academic achievements, the calendar marked with his important dates, the coffee pot that had made thousands of cups during late-night study sessions. And Tommy realized he'd just broken something that might never be repaired. I should go to bed, Dolores said finally. I have the early shift tomorrow. She walked past him without another word, leaving Tommy alone at the kitchen table with his speech about gratitude and family support, the cursor still blinking at the end of a sentence he no longer knew how to finish. From down the hall, he heard her bedroom door close with a quiet click that somehow sounded louder than if she'd slammed it. Tommy sat in the silence of the kitchen, understanding for the first time in his life what it meant to get exactly what. you asked for and discover it was the last thing you actually wanted. The next morning, Tommy woke to the sound of his mother's alarm clock through the thin walls, the same sound that had marked the beginning of countless early shifts over the years. He lay in bed, listening to her quiet movements, the careful way she tried not to wake him even when she was angry, and felt the weight of their conversations settle over him like a physical presence. When he finally emerged from his room, she was already gone. A plate of scrambled eggs sat covered on the counter next to a note written in her familiar handwriting. "Have a good day at school. Love, Mom." The same note she'd been leaving him for years, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. At school, Tommy moved through his classes like a ghost. During lunch, Missy found him sitting alone in the library, staring at a textbook he wasn't reading. "You look terrible," she said, sliding into the chair beside him. "Thanks. That's exactly what I needed to hear. What's wrong? And don't say, 'Nothing,' because you've got that look you get when you're spiraling about something." Tommy closed the textbook and leaned back in his chair. The library was nearly empty, most students outside enjoying the warm May weather, but he felt safer here among the books than facing the curious looks of his classmates. "I asked my mom not to come to graduation." Missy's expression shifted from concern to something harder to read. "You what?" "I asked her not to come last night and she— God, Missy, you should have seen her face." "Why would you do that?" The question hung between them, and Tommy realized he didn't have a good answer. The reasons that had seemed so compelling in his mind, the social pressure, the fear of embarrassment, the desire for one perfect day, sounded petty and cruel when he tried to articulate them. "You saw what happened at the reception," he said finally. "The way Mrs. Colton looked at her, the way everyone looked at her. So I just wanted one day where I didn't have to worry about whether my family fit in." Missy was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was careful. "Tommy, do you remember when you first started hanging out with Marcus in that crowd? What does that have to do with anything? You came home one day talking differently, using bigger words, speaking more softly. I asked you about it, and you said you were just adapting to your environment." Tommy remembered that conversation, remembered how proud he'd been of his ability to code switch, to fit in wherever he needed to. "Your mom noticed too," Missy continued. "She asked me if you were ashamed of how you grew up. I told her no, that you were just learning how to navigate different worlds. But maybe I was wrong." The observation hit harder than Tommy expected. "I'm not ashamed of how I grew up." "No? Then why does it matter what Mrs. Colton thinks? Why does it matter if your mom's dress comes from a thrift store or if she talks too loud when she's excited?" Before Tommy could answer, Missy stood up, her expression disappointed in a way that made his chest tight. "I have to get to class, but Tommy, your mom is the reason you're giving that valedictorian speech. Maybe you should remember that." Meanwhile, Dolores sat in the break room at Murphy's Diner, picking at a sandwich she didn't want while her co-workers chatted around her. The lunch rush was over, and the afternoon lull always left too much time to think. "You okay, honey?" asked Sally, the other waitress who'd been working at Murphy's almost as long as Dolores. "You've been quiet all day." "Just tired." "Tired." "My foot." "You look like somebody shot your dog. What's going on?" Dolores considered deflecting, but Sally had been her closest friend for years. If anyone would understand, it would be her. "Tommy asked me not to come to graduation." The break room went quiet. Even the cook, who'd been reading a newspaper in the corner, looked up. "He what now?" Sally's voice carried the indignation of someone ready to fight on behalf of a friend. "He's embarrassed by me. Doesn't want me there when he gives his speech." "That boy has lost his damn mind," Sally declared. "After everything you've done for him?" Maybe he's right. The words came out smaller than Dolores intended. Maybe I don't belong at something like that. Don't you dare, Sally said fiercely. Don't you dare let that boy make you feel small. You raised him, Dolores. You worked yourself to the bone to give him opportunities. If anyone belongs at that graduation, it's you. But the doubt had been planted, and it was growing. Dolores had spent the morning replaying every school event she'd attended, every interaction with other parents, wondering if she'd been oblivious to signs that she didn't fit in. After work, she drove to her father's apartment, needing the comfort of someone who'd known her before she became defined by her sacrifices and struggles. Pops was sitting on his small porch, as he did most evenings, watching the neighborhood kids play in the street. At 84, he moved slowly, but his mind was still sharp as ever. "You look troubled," he said as she settled into the chair beside him. "Tommy doesn't want me at graduation." Pops was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this information. "Did he say why?" "Because I embarrass him. Because I don't fit in with the other families." "And what did you tell him?" "Nothing. What was I supposed to say? That he was wrong? That I do fit in?" Dolores laughed bitterly. "We both know I don't." "So?" The simple question caught her off guard. So you don't fit in with people who judge others by their clothes or their jobs or their bank accounts. Why is that a bad thing? Dolores looked at her father, this man who'd worked in dangerous conditions for 30 years to provide for his family, who'd never owned a suit but had never compromised his dignity. "Because I wanted better for him. I wanted him to have choices I never had." And he does. But part of having choices is learning which ones matter and which ones don't. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun began to set over the Kentucky hills. Finally, Pop spoke again. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think that boy is scared. Scared of leaving home, scared of college, scared of growing up. And when people are scared, they sometimes hurt the people who love them most because they know that love is strong enough to survive it." "What if it's not?" "Then he'll learn that some mistakes can't be undone. But that's his lesson to learn, not yours to prevent." As Dolores drove home in the gathering darkness, she passed the high school where graduation would take place in 2 weeks. The building stood empty and quiet, but she could imagine it filled with families celebrating their children's achievements. For 18 years, she'd imagined herself in that audience, watching her son cross the stage. She'd imagined taking pictures, maybe crying a little, feeling proud enough to burst. Now she wondered if that dream had always been hers alone. At home, she found Tommy at the kitchen table, his graduation speech spread out in front of him. He looked up when she entered, his eyes red-rimmed and hopeful. "Mom? I made your favorite for dinner," she said, not quite ready for the conversation they both knew was coming. Meatloaf and mashed potatoes. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't rejection either. It was the space between hurt and healing, where families learned whether love was strong enough to survive the worst things they could do to each other. Tommy nodded and returned to his speech, both of them pretending that the careful distance between them was temporary. That morning would bring clarity to decisions that felt. The following afternoon, Tommy was surprised to find Pops waiting by his locker after school, leaning heavily on his cane, but wearing the determined expression that meant he had something important to say. "Pops, what are you doing here?" "Came to see you. Figured we needed to talk." Tommy glanced around the hallway, aware of classmates passing by. But Pops seemed oblivious to the curious looks his presence drew. At 84, he'd earned the right to appear wherever he pleased without explanation. "Want to sit outside?" Tommy suggested. They found a bench under the oak trees behind the school, where Tommy had eaten lunch during his freshman year before he'd found his place among the honor students. Pops lowered himself carefully onto the weathered wood, his breathing slightly labored from the walk. "Your mama told me about your conversation," Pops said without preamble. Tommy's stomach clenched. "Pops, I can explain." "Don't need you to explain. Need you to listen. The old man was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts the way he always did before saying something important. You know, when your mama was about your age, she was dating this boy from town. Nice enough kid, but his family had money. Real money. One day, she came home crying because his mother had made some comment about appropriate matches and how important it was for young people to stay within their social circles. Tommy shifted uncomfortably on the bench, recognizing something familiar in the story. Your mama was heartbroken. Not because she loved the boy so much, but because she'd started to believe that woman might be right. That maybe she wasn't good enough, wasn't refined enough, wasn't whatever enough. A group of students walked past, laughing about something, and Pops waited until they were out of earshot before continuing. I told her then what I'm gonna tell you now. There's two kinds of people in this world, Tommy. People who judge others by what they have, and people who judge others by what they do. The first kind will never think you're enough, no matter how much you achieve. The second kind already know you are. It's not that simple, Pops. Isn't it? The old man turned to look at Tommy directly. Tell me something. When you give that speech, when you're standing up there talking about success and achievement, who do you think should get credit for that moment? Me, I guess. My teachers. The people who helped me. Your mama work 3 jobs to pay for your tutoring? Yes. She drive you to every academic competition even when her car was barely running? Yes. She sit up with you when you were struggling with calculus, even though she never made it past 10th grade herself? Tommy's throat tightened. Yes. Then seems to me she's earned the right to watch you give that speech. They sat in silence for a moment, watching a maintenance worker mow the school's front lawn. The sound of the mower was rhythmic, peaceful, but Tommy's mind was churning. You want to know what your mama did when that boy's family made her feel small? Pops asked. What? She worked harder, studied more, made herself better, not for them, but for herself. She never did marry that boy, but she never let anyone make her feel less than again, at least not until now. The words hit like a physical blow. I didn't mean to make her feel... But you did. And the question now is what you're gonna do about it. Before Tommy could answer, Pops continued. Let me tell you something about embarrassment, son. Real embarrassment isn't having a mama who works in a diner. Real embarrassment is being the kind of person who'd be ashamed of someone who sacrificed everything for you. That evening, Pops made his way slowly up the steps to Dolores's house, his arthritis making the climb more difficult than it used to be. He found her in the kitchen, mechanically washing dishes that were already clean. You're gonna wear the pattern off those plates if you keep scrubbing them, he said by way of greeting. Dolores looked up, startled. Daddy? What are you doing here? Came to check on my daughter, heard she's been having a rough time. She dried her hands on a dish towel and leaned against the counter, suddenly looking older than her 58 years. I don't know what to do. About graduation? About everything. About Tommy. About whether I should go. About whether... I've been fooling myself all these years thinking I was doing right by him. Pops lowered himself into a kitchen chair, the same one he'd sat in countless times over the years. Tell me what you're thinking. I'm thinking maybe he's right. Maybe I don't belong at something like that. Maybe I've been selfish, wanting to be there when it would be better for him if I stayed home. You think staying away would be better? For him? I think it would be easier for him. Those two things aren't the same. Dolores poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from her father. Remember when I was little and you'd work those double shifts at the mine? I used to be so embarrassed when other kids talked about their dad's jobs. You'd come home covered in coal dust, exhausted, and I'd think about how different we were from other families. I remember. When did I stop being embarrassed and start being proud? Pops smiled, his weathered face creasing with the memory. The day you understood what that coal dust represented, what those double shifts meant, what I was willing to do because I loved you. Tommy's not there yet. No, he's not. He's 18 and scared and trying to figure out who he wants to be. But that doesn't mean you should make yourself smaller to accommodate his fear. They drank their coffee in comfortable silence, the way they had through countless conversations over the years. Finally, Dolores spoke. What if I go and he's mortified? What if I ruin his big day? What if you don't go and he realizes too late what he threw away? The question hung between them, weighted with all the complexity of love and pride and the sacrifices parents make for their children. I raised him to be better than this, Dolores said quietly. You did, and he will be. But first, he has to choose to be. As Pops prepared to leave, he paused at the door. Dolores, that navy dress you bought for graduation? What about it? Make sure it's clean. You might need it. After he left, Dolores sat alone in her kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of 18 years of single motherhood. Report cards held to the refrigerator with magnets, photos from school events where she was always the loudest parent cheering. Academic awards she'd displayed with pride. For the first time since Tommy's request, she allowed herself to imagine graduation day not as something to avoid, but as something she'd earned the right to witness. The thought scared her almost as much as staying away did, but it felt like the beginning of a decision rather than the continuation of doubt. Outside, night settled over their small Kentucky town, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of the high school marching band practicing for graduation. The melody drifted through her open windows, carrying with it the promise of ceremony, celebration, and choices that would define not just Tommy's future, but the kind of relationship they would have going forward. Tomorrow would bring new conversations, new decisions, and perhaps the courage to choose love over fear. With 5 days left until graduation, the weight of unresolved tension filled the Hutchins house like humidity before a storm. Tommy had barely slept, spending his nights staring at the ceiling and listening to his mother's quiet movements through the thin walls. She'd taken to making breakfast before he woke up, leaving his plate covered on the counter with those same careful notes that said everything and nothing at all. On Thursday morning, Tommy found himself standing in front of his bedroom mirror, practicing his valedictorian speech for what felt like the 100th time. But every time he reached the section about family and gratitude, the words felt hollow in his mouth. Thank you to the families who supported us through this journey, he recited to his reflection. Your sacrifices made our success possible. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, preparing to thank families for their sacrifices while actively rejecting the woman who had sacrificed the most. His phone buzzed with a text from Missy. Coffee after school? We need to talk. Tommy knew that tone, even in text form. Missy had been giving him space to work through his feelings, but her patience was clearly running thin. Meanwhile, Dolores sat in the employee break room at Murphy's Diner, staring at the graduation invitation she'd carried in her purse for weeks. The formal script announced the ceremony with all its pomp and circumstance, and at the bottom, in smaller print, it reminded families that seating was limited and tickets were required. She had 2 tickets, one for herself, one for Pops. She'd been so proud when Tommy brought them home, so excited about finally having official permission to attend the most important day of her son's life. Now those tickets felt like an accusation. Still thinking. About graduation? Sally asked, sliding into the chair across from her. Can't stop thinking about it. You decide what you're going to do? Dolores folded the invitation carefully, creasing the edges with precise movements. I keep going back and forth. 1 minute I think Tommy's right, that I should respect his wishes. The next minute I'm angry that he even asked. What does your gut tell you? My gut tells me to march into that gymnasium and take my seat in the front row, because I earned it. But my heart tells me that maybe the best gift I can give him is staying away. Sally shook her head. Honey, you've been giving that boy everything his whole life. Maybe it's time to stop giving and start taking what's yours. Before Dolores could respond, their conversation was interrupted by a familiar voice from the diner's main dining area. Well, I'll be. Dolores Hutchins, right? Dolores looked up to see Brenda Colton standing at the break room entrance, dressed in tennis whites and carrying the kind of expensive handbag that cost more than Dolores made in a month. Mrs. Colton, what brings you to Murphy's? Oh, I was just driving by and remembered hearing someone mention this was where you worked. I wanted to have a little chat about graduation. The word chat carried enough condescension to make Sally visibly bristle, but Dolores gestured for her friend to stay calm. What about graduation? Mrs. Colton stepped fully into the break room, her gaze taking in the worn furniture and faded motivational posters with barely concealed disdain. Well, I've been thinking about our conversation at the reception, and I realize there might have been some misunderstanding. I certainly didn't mean to suggest that your family was anything other than charming. The pause before charming was deliberate, calculated to sting. I appreciate that, Dolores said carefully. The thing is, graduation is such an important day for all our children. And I know how much Tommy means to you. But sometimes as parents, we have to ask ourselves what's truly best for our children, even when it's difficult for us personally. Sally stood up abruptly. I'm sorry, who are you to tell this woman what's best for her son? Mrs. Colton's smile turned sharp. I'm simply someone who understands the importance of appropriate settings for important occasions. And you think Dolores isn't appropriate for her son's graduation? I think Dolores loves her son very much, and sometimes love means stepping back. The conversation had the quality of a chess match, each move calculated, each word chosen for maximum impact. Dolores felt the familiar burn of shame rising in her chest, the same feeling she'd carried since childhood whenever someone made her feel small. But then she remembered Pops's words about the two kinds of people in the world, and something shifted inside her. You know what, Mrs. Colton? Dolores stood up, her voice steady. You're absolutely right. Love does mean stepping back sometimes, but it also means standing up. And I've been standing up for my son for 18 years. Mrs. Colton's composure slipped slightly. I'm sure. You have. I've stood up to teachers who underestimated him. I've stood up to guidance counselors who thought college wasn't realistic for kids like us. I've stood up to every obstacle that tried to keep him from achieving what he's achieved. Dolores took a step closer, her voice gaining strength with each word. And you know what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to let fear of what people like you think keep me from standing up for him one more time. Mrs. Colton opened her mouth to respond, but Dolores wasn't finished. My son is valedictorian because I taught him that hard work matters more than appearances. Because I showed him that integrity is more important than acceptance. Because I loved him enough to sacrifice everything so he could have choices. The break room was silent, except for the distant sounds of the diner's kitchen. Mrs. Colton's face had gone pale, her careful composure cracking under the force of Dolores's conviction. And if my presence at his graduation makes you or anyone else uncomfortable, well, that sounds like your problem, not mine. Mrs. Colton recovered enough to force a tight smile. Well, I can see you've made up your mind. Yes, I have. After Mrs. Colton left, Sally broke into a grin. Now that's the Dolores I know. About time you reminded yourself who you are. But as Dolores returned to work, her hands shaking slightly from adrenaline, she realized she'd made a commitment she wasn't sure she was ready to keep. The conversation with Mrs. Colton had crystallized something important. Her right to be at graduation was not debatable. But whether exercising that right was the best thing for Tommy remained an open question. That evening, she found herself standing in her bedroom, looking at the navy dress hanging in her closet. It was simple, but elegant, the kind of dress that would allow her to blend in rather than stand out. She'd chosen it carefully, thinking about Mrs. Colton and women like her, trying to find something that would meet their unstated requirements for appropriateness. Now it seemed like a costume for a play she no longer wanted to perform in. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Pops's voice came through clearly, as if he could sense her internal struggle. "How you doing, honey? I think I've made a decision about graduation." "Yeah? What's that?" "I'm going. Mrs. Colton came by the diner today and reminded me exactly why I need to be there." "Good for you. What about Tommy?" Dolores was quiet for a moment, considering the question that had been haunting her for days. "Tommy's going? To have to decide whether he's more embarrassed by having me there or more ashamed of asking me to stay away. Either way, it's his choice to make." That's my daughter talking. As she hung up the phone, Dolores felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in weeks. She would attend graduation, not because it was easy or comfortable, but because it was right. Because she had earned that seat through 18 years of love and sacrifice. What happened between her and Tommy after that would depend on what kind of man she'd raised him to be. The decision felt both liberating and terrifying, but for the first time since their kitchen conversation, it felt like hers to make. Tommy's alarm buzzed at 6:30 a.m., though he'd been awake for hours watching the Kentucky sunrise creep across his bedroom ceiling. Graduation day had arrived with the kind of perfect weather that seemed designed for ceremony. Clear skies, gentle breeze, the promise of a day that would be remembered forever. But as he lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of morning in their small house, Tommy felt nothing but dread. From the kitchen came the gentle clatter of breakfast preparation, the same sounds that had marked every important day of his life. His mother was making pancakes. He could smell them. The special ones she only made for birthdays and achievements. The gesture felt like both a peace offering and a rebuke. When he finally made his way to the kitchen, he found her standing at the stove, dressed in her robe with her graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She looked smaller than usual, more fragile, but there was something different in her posture. A kind of quiet determination he hadn't seen since their argument. "Morning, honey," she said without turning around. "Figured you'd want a good breakfast before your big day." "Thanks, Mom." She set a plate in front of him, 3 perfect pancakes arranged just the way she'd done since he was small, with a smiley face made of butter pats and syrup. The childish presentation should have embarrassed him, but instead it made his throat tight with emotion. They ate in careful silence, both of them aware that this breakfast might be their last peaceful moment together for a while. Finally, Tommy worked up the courage to ask the question that had been consuming him. "Are you—" Oh, he stopped, started again. "What are your plans for today?" Dolores set down her coffee mug and looked at him directly for the first time in days. Her eyes were calm, resolved, and somehow that was worse than if she'd been angry. "I'm going to graduation, Tommy." The words hit him like a physical blow, even though part of him had known this moment was coming. "Mom, I'm not finished." Her voice was gentle but firm. "I've thought about what you said, really thought about it. And I understand why you're scared. But I've been scared too. Scared of not being good enough, scared of embarrassing you, scared of not fitting in with people who've had advantages we never had." She stood up and began clearing the breakfast dishes, her movements precise and controlled. "But I realized something this week. I've spent 18 years teaching you to be proud of who you are, to never let anyone make you feel small, to stand up for what's right even when it's hard. And then, when you asked me to stay away from the most important day of your life, I almost forgot my own lessons." Tommy felt tears threatening and hated himself for it. "Mom, please." "I'm going to be there, honey, in the 3rd row, where my ticket says I belong. And when they call your name and you walk across that stage, I'm going to be proud. Not quiet proud, not polite proud, but the kind of proud that fills up a whole gymnasium." She turned to face him fully, and he could see the woman who had worked 3 jobs, who had fought for his education, who had never backed down from anything that mattered. Now, what you do with that is up to you. You can be embarrassed by my love, or you can be grateful for it. But either way, it's going to be there. After she left for work, she'd volunteered to cover the early shift so she could leave in time for the ceremony. Tommy sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the remnants of his pancakes and feeling like the worst person in the world. His phone buzzed with messages from classmates, excited chatter about the day ahead, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. Instead, he found himself thinking about the speech folded in his backpack, the words he'd written about gratitude and perseverance, and the people who had made his success possible. By noon, he was at the school, going through the final rehearsal with his classmates. The gymnasium had been transformed overnight. Rows of folding chairs filled the floor, a temporary stage erected at one end, banners and flowers creating an atmosphere of celebration that felt almost surreal. "Remember, when I call your name, walk confidently across the stage," Principal Thornfield instructed the graduates. "Shake with your right hand, receive your diploma with your left, pause for photos, then exit stage right." Tommy went through the motions mechanically, but his eyes kept drifting to the third row of seats where his mother would be sitting in just a few hours. He tried to imagine the moment differently, his mother beaming in the audience, her pride uncomplicated by his shame, the way it should have been all along. But he'd broken something between them, and he didn't know how to fix it. "You okay?" Missy appeared beside him as they lined up for the final practice processional. She looked beautiful in her cap and gown, her confidence a sharp contrast to his anxiety. "Not really. Your mom coming?" "Yeah. Good." There was no judgment in her voice, just simple approval that somehow made him feel worse. As the rehearsal ended, and the graduates dispersed to prepare for the evening ceremony, Tommy found himself walking to his car on autopilot. He had 3 hours to get ready, 3 hours to figure out how to give a speech about gratitude while knowing he'd hurt the person he should be most grateful for. At home, he showered and dressed carefully in the suit Pops had bought him. Navy blue, simple but well-fitted, appropriate for the occasion. As he knotted his tie, he caught sight of himself in the mirror and saw something of his mother in his reflection. The determined set of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders when he was nervous, the dark eyes that had always been too serious for his age. He was her son, shaped by her love and her sacrifices, whether he was brave enough to acknowledge it, publicly or not. Downstairs, he found a note on the kitchen counter. "So proud of you, baby, today and every day. Love, Mom." The simple words broke something loose in his chest, and for the first time since their argument, Tommy allowed himself to cry. Not the careful, controlled tears he'd been fighting all week, but the deep, body-shaking sobs of someone who had realized too late what they'd thrown away. When he finally stopped crying, Tommy looked at his reflection in the kitchen window and made a decision that would define not just this day, but the kind of man he wanted to become. There were still 2 hours until graduation, enough time to find his mother and try to repair what he'd broken, enough time to remember who had taught him about courage in the first place, enough time perhaps to become worthy of the love he'd been too afraid to claim. By 5 o'clock, the gymnasium buzzed with the energy of families gathering for celebration. Tommy stood in the hallway with his fellow graduates, adjusting his cap and trying to calm his nerves as the processional music began. Through the doors, he could hear the murmur of hundreds of voices, the rustle of programs, the excitement that marked every graduation ceremony. "Places, everyone," Principal Thornfield called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had orchestrated dozens of these ceremonies. "Remember, this is your moment. Walk with pride." As the graduates lined up alphabetically, Tommy found himself scanning the crowd through the small windows in the gymnasium doors. He spotted Missy's parents in the 4th row, elegant and composed. Marcus Wellington's family occupied prime seats near the front, his father checking his expensive watch with practiced ease. and then he saw her. Dolores sat exactly where she'd said she would. Third row, center section, wearing the navy dress she'd bought weeks ago. Her hair was styled simply, but carefully, and she wore the pearl earrings that had belonged to Tommy's grandmother. She looked beautiful, dignified, and completely out of place among the other families. But what struck Tommy most was her expression. She wasn't looking around nervously or fidgeting with her purse like he'd expected. Instead, she sat straight-backed and calm, her hands folded in her lap, watching the empty stage with the quiet patience of someone who had waited 18 years for this moment. Beside her, Pops leaned heavily on his cane, dressed in his Sunday best, a shirt Tommy remembered from church services and the same tie he'd worn to every important family event for the past decade. Despite his age and declining health, there was something proud and unshakable about his presence. "Hutchins, you're up," the student coordinator whispered, and Tommy realized the processional had begun. He walked into the gymnasium with measured steps, the familiar space transformed by ceremony and occasion. The ceiling seemed higher, the air more charged with possibility, but his eyes kept drifting to that third row, where his mother sat watching him with an expression of pure, uncomplicated love. As Tommy took his place among the honor students, in the front row, Principal Thornfield approached the podium. Her voice carried clearly over the sound system as she welcomed families and began the formal proceedings. "Today, we celebrate not just our graduates, but the families who supported them, the teachers who guided them, and the community that nurtured their dreams." The words felt simultaneously generic and deeply personal. Tommy glanced again at his mother, who was listening intently as if every word applied specifically to her son. The ceremony proceeded with its traditional elements: the national anthem, remarks from the superintendent, recognition of special achievements. When they announced the scholarship recipients, Tommy heard his mother's sharp intake of breath as his name was called, followed by what sounded suspiciously like a suppressed, "That's my boy." Finally, Principal Thornfield returned to the podium for the introduction that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to present our valedictorian, Thomas Michael Hutchins." The applause was polite, respectful, but Tommy could hear one voice rising above the rest, his mother's enthusiastic clapping that echoed through the gymnasium like punctuation marks of pride. As he approached the podium, Tommy looked out at the sea of faces and felt the weight of the moment settling over him. In a few minutes, he would deliver the speech he'd been crafting for weeks, words about achievement and gratitude and the people who had made this moment possible. But first, he had to decide who he wanted to be when he spoke those words: the young man who was ashamed of where he came from, or the one who understood that everything good in his life had grown from the soil of his mother's unwavering love. Tommy stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of faces bathed in the warm light of the gymnasium. The microphone amplified his breathing slightly as he unfolded his prepared speech, the words he'd practiced countless times blurring before his eyes. "Thank you, Principal Thornfield, faculty, families, and fellow graduates," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "4 years ago, we walked into this school as children. Today, we leave as adults, ready to face whatever challenges await us." The opening was safe, rehearsed, the kind of introduction that could have come from any valedictorian speech in the past decade. But as Tommy continued, something unexpected happened. His eyes found his mother's face in the third row, and the prepared words began to feel hollow. "We've been told that success is about individual achievement, about pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps and making something of ourselves through sheer force of will." He paused, deviating slightly from his script. "But standing here today, I know that's not the whole truth." In the audience, Dolores leaned forward slightly, sensing something different in her son's tone. "The truth is that none of us achieved this alone. We succeeded because people believed in us when we didn't believe in ourselves. Because people sacrificed so we could have opportunities they never had. Because people loved us enough to work multiple jobs, to drive cars with 200,000 miles, to give up their own dreams so ours could flourish. Tommy's voice grew stronger with each word, the speech transforming from generic platitudes into something raw and personal. My mother works 3 jobs. She's a waitress at Murphy's Diner, where she serves coffee and kindness to anyone who walks through the door. She cleans houses for families who have more money than we've ever dreamed of, and she works part-time at a factory, doing work that leaves her hands rough and her back aching. He could see some families shifting uncomfortably, unused to such specific working-class details in a graduation speech. But he could also see others, parents who recognized their own struggles, students who understood what it meant to fight for every opportunity, leaning in with recognition. She did all of this not because she had to, but because she chose to. Because she decided that my education, my future, my dreams were worth more than her comfort, her social life, her own aspirations. In the 3rd row, Dolores had tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling with a radiance that seemed to light up her entire section of the gymnasium. And you know what the most remarkable thing about my mother is? She never once made me feel like her sacrifices were a burden. She never made me feel guilty for the opportunities she gave me. She just loved me, completely and unconditionally, and believed I could achieve things she'd never had the chance to achieve herself. Tommy paused, his voice thick with emotion. 2 weeks ago, I made the worst mistake of my life. I let fear and shame convince me that my mother's love was something to be embarrassed by instead of something to be grateful for. I asked her not to come to graduation because I was worried about what other people would think. A murmur went through the audience. This was not the kind of confession usually heard at graduation ceremonies. But she came anyway. She's sitting right there in the 3rd row, wearing a dress she bought at a thrift store and pearl earrings that belonged to my grandmother. She came because she understands something I'm only learning now, that love doesn't make itself smaller to accommodate fear. That pride in your family isn't something you earn by achieving the right social status, that the people who matter most are the ones who show up, especially when showing up is hard. Tommy looked directly at his mother, speaking the next words, as if they were having a private conversation. Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I let other people's opinions matter more than your feelings. I'm sorry I forgot that everything I am, everything I've achieved exists because you loved me enough to make it possible. And I'm sorry it took me standing up here, in front of all these people, to remember what you taught me from the beginning, that we don't need anyone's permission to be proud of who we are. The gymnasium had fallen completely silent. Even the babies had stopped fussing, as if sensing the weight of the moment. Tommy took a deep breath and looked back at his fellow graduates. So, to my classmates, as we leave here today, remember this. Success isn't just about what you achieve. It's about remembering who helped you achieve it, and having the courage to honor them publicly, especially when it's uncomfortable. As he concluded his speech with remarks about the future and hope and the bonds that would always connect their graduating class, Tommy felt something shift inside him. The applause that followed was different from the polite clapping that had marked the rest of the ceremony. It was warmer, more genuine, marked by the kind of recognition that comes when truth is spoken in a place usually reserved for platitudes. But before Tommy could leave the podium, Principal Thornfield approached the microphone, her expression suggesting she was about to do something unplanned. "Thank you, Tommy, for those heartfelt words," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there during the formal proceedings. "I think we can all agree that behind every successful student is a family that believed in their potential." She paused, scanning the audience until her eyes found Dolores in the 3rd row. "Mrs. Hutchins, I wonder if you might join us up here for a moment. I think, after listening to your son's speech, we'd all love to hear a few words from the woman who made this moment possible The request hung in the air like an invitation and a challenge. In the third row, Dolores looked stunned, her face cycling through surprise, panic, and something that might have been terror. Tommy watched from beside the podium as his mother slowly stood up, the gymnasium's attention focused entirely on her, small figure in the navy dress. This was the moment he had feared most, his mother at the center of attention, unprepared and unfiltered, about to speak to hundreds of people who had just heard about her working-class life in uncomfortable detail. But as she made her way toward the stage, Tommy realized that his fear had never been about his mother's inadequacy. It had been about his own. Dolores May Hutchins had never walked a longer distance than the 50 feet from her seat to the graduation stage. Every step felt magnified, echoing through the silent gymnasium as hundreds of eyes tracked her movement. Her navy dress, chosen so carefully to help her blend in, now felt like a spotlight drawing attention to everything she'd tried to minimize about herself. But as she climbed the steps to the stage, something remarkable happened. The fear that had gripped her chest began to transform into something else, not confidence exactly, but a kind of settled determination. She thought of Pops in the audience, of Sally and her co-workers who had encouraged her, of 18 years of fighting for her son's dreams. She thought of Mrs. Colton's condescending smile and realized she didn't care anymore what people like. That thought. Principal Thornfield handed her the microphone with an encouraging nod, and Dolores found herself looking out at a sea of faces that suddenly seemed less intimidating and more human. In the third row, Pops gave her a thumbs up. In the fourth row, she spotted Sally, who had somehow managed to sneak away from the diner to witness this moment. "Well," Dolores began, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "I didn't exactly prepare a speech, so you're going to get the unvarnished truth." A ripple of laughter moved through the audience, and Dolores felt some of her tension ease. "My son just told you I work 3 jobs, and that's true. What he didn't tell you is that I've loved every minute of it, because every shift, every tired evening, every sacrifice was an investment in standing right here, right now, watching him become the man I always knew he could be." She paused, looking directly at Tommy, who stood beside the podium with tears in his eyes. Tommy apologized. "To me up here in front of all of you, and I appreciate that. But the truth is, he doesn't need to apologize for being 18 and scared and trying to figure out where he belongs in a world that's bigger than anything he's known before." Dolores's voice grew stronger, more assured, as she found her rhythm. "You see, when you grow up the way we did, counting every penny, shopping at thrift stores, driving cars that break down more often than they run, you learn to be grateful for things other folks take for granted. You learn that dignity isn't about what you wear or where you live or how much money you have. It's about how you treat people and how hard you're willing to work for the things that matter." In the audience, she could see some parents nodding, recognizing their own stories in her words. "Tommy was embarrassed by me, and you know what? I understand that. When you're 18 and you've worked as hard as he has to earn a place among kids whose families have advantages you've never dreamed of, it's natural to worry about fitting in." She looked out at the families, her gaze sweeping over the designer clothes and expensive jewelry, the carefully styled hair and practiced social graces. "But here's what I've learned in 58 years on this earth. The people worth impressing are the ones who are impressed by character, not by appearances. The people who matter are the ones who judge you by your actions, not your accent or your job or your zip code." Dolores's voice carried a warmth that seemed to embrace the entire gymnasium. "I work at Murphy's Diner, and you know what I see. There, every day, I see construction workers who tip their last dollar because they remember what it's like to struggle. I see teachers who stop by after long days because they need someone to listen to their stories about difficult students and tight budgets. I see families celebrating birthdays with pancakes because it's what they can afford, and their joy is just as real as any fancy restaurant celebration." She paused, her eyes finding the section where she'd noticed some uncomfortable shifting during Tommy's speech. "I see humanity in all its forms, and I've learned that kindness matters more than pedigree, that generosity of spirit is worth more than generosity of wallet, and that the most important thing you can teach your children is that their worth isn't determined by other people's opinions." The gymnasium was completely silent now, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Engaged, respectful, moved. "So, to all the graduates sitting here today, let me tell you something your fancy speakers might not mention. You're going to face moments when you're tempted to be ashamed of where you came from. You're going to encounter people who make you feel like you need to apologize for your family, your background, your story." Dolores's voice grew firm, carrying the authority of someone who had learned these lessons the hard way. Don't you dare let anyone convince you that love looks wrong, or that sacrifice isn't sophisticated enough, or that working-class pride needs to apologize for itself. You carry your family's story with you, and that story, whatever it is your strength, not your weakness. She looked back at Tommy, her expression soft with love and forgiveness. "Tommy, baby, you don't need to choose between honoring your family and succeeding in the world. The best parts of who you are come from both. Take your work ethic and your humility and your understanding of what real struggle looks like, and you use those gifts to make the world better." Dolores turned back to the audience for her final words. "And to all the families here today, whether you're wearing designer suits or thrift store dresses, whether you drove here in a BMW or a 20-year-old pickup truck, be proud. Be proud of the love that brought you here. Be proud of the sacrifices you made. And be proud of these amazing young people who are going to change the world." She handed the microphone back to Principal Thornfield and walked directly to Tommy, who met her with the biggest hug of his life. In that embrace, witnessed by hundreds of people, all the hurt and misunderstanding of the past weeks dissolved into something simpler and more powerful. Unconditional love between a mother and son who had both learned something important about courage. The applause that followed was thunderous, sustained, and genuine. But what mattered most to Dolores was the sound of her son's voice, barely audible over the noise, saying, "I love you, Mom. I'm so proud to be your son." As they walked off the stage together, Dolores caught sight of Mrs. Colton in the audience. The woman was clapping politely, but her expression suggested she was seeing something she hadn't expected. A working-class woman who refused to be diminished by anyone's expectations. Later, as families gathered for photos and celebrations, Tommy and Dolores found themselves surrounded by classmates and parents who wanted to thank Dolores for her words. But the moment that mattered most came when they were finally alone, standing beside Pops's old pickup truck in the parking lot. "Mom," Tommy said, "I know I hurt you, and I know saying sorry doesn't fix everything. But I want you to know that today, listening to you speak, I understood something I should have known all along." "What's that, baby?" "That I didn't need to choose between loving you and succeeding in the world. I needed to succeed because I love you, not in spite of it." Dolores smiled, the kind of smile that contained 18 years of love and sacrifice, and hope fulfilled. "Now that," she said, "sounds like wisdom worth learning." As they drove home together through the Kentucky hills, graduation caps on the dashboard and the future stretching out ahead of them, both mother and son understood that they had found their way back to each other through the simple act of choosing. Love over fear, authenticity over acceptance, and truth over the comfortable lies that keep families apart. The conversation that had begun in heartbreak had ended in healing, and graduation day had become exactly what it was meant to be: a celebration of achievement earned through love, sacrifice, and the courage to be proud of who you are. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us,